This is an episode of Unconfined, a podcast of the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future in Baltimore, Maryland. You can find us online at clf.jhsph.edu. Mike Milley is our sound engineer and produced our theme music. Your hosts are me, Tom Philpott, and Christine Grillo. Paulette Wilson is a producer, and Natalie Wood Wright is the executive producer. The opinions expressed here are not necessarily those of Johns Hopkins University or of the Center for a Livable Future.
Welcome to the third series of the Center for a Livable Future's Unconfined Podcast. In this series, we are going to be exploring solutions to food system problems, and we're going to focus on farming models that embrace regenerative principles. Regenerative farming models offer solutions to some of the biggest problems created by and exacerbated by food production. For example, the fact that food systems account for a third of all global greenhouse gas emissions. Our current conventional food production practices put farmers in a bind where they're forced to rely on pesticides and synthetic fossil fuel-dependent fertilizers, both of which play a role in polluting our air, soil, and waterways. Our current practices can make life pretty miserable for the people and animals involved, and for the communities where the operations are sited, and also does a pretty bad job on the microbes in the soil. And today we're going to geek out on the world of microbes and the solutions that they can offer for us. We have special guest Leo Horrigan to talk with us about some of these solutions. Leo is a food system correspondent who has been with the Center for a Livable Future for 20 years. And last year he wrote a book for the center titled, What If CAFOs Were History? And for those of you who don't know, a CAFO is a concentrated animal feeding operation, also known as factory farms. Leo is currently working on another publication about the wild and exciting world of soil microbes and regenerative practices, and he's going to walk us through how it all works. Welcome, Leo.
Thanks for having me. I didn't have to come far.
To kick off this series, maybe you could just give us the elevator pitch, the sort of one sentence lowdown on, for those of us who don't know, the unanointed, what is regenerative agriculture?
Sure. When I first heard that term, regenerative agriculture, it begged the question, well, what is being regenerated? And what's being regenerated is the microbes in the soil, the ecology of the soil, and the soil is a living thing. So that is what's being regenerated, and that's what creates soil as well. It's those microbes in the soil that actually create soil.
Okay, so when we talk about healthy soil, that is soil that has a diversity of microbes.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, and can you tell us what the soil food web is? That's a word that comes up a lot.
So the soil food web is a way of describing that there's an ecology there. There's all these organisms that are interacting with each other in different ways. Some of them are preying on each other, and other ones are collaborating with each other. It actually seems to be more collaboration than anything. But there's also, competition and predation. So it's that whole complex of relationships. I mean, we're used to seeing that above ground when we see how, birds and plants interact, or, all these interactions above ground. They're easy to see, but the ones below ground, unfortunately, we need a microscope to see them, but they can be, pretty fascinating.
Okay, so we'll talk about how the soil food web works and what benefits it can offer us when it's working well. But before we do that, let's take a step back, and maybe you can explain to those of us who haven't spent our lives farming, what do farmers wake up and worry about? What are the challenges that they face?
Okay. I should point out, I'm not a farmer either, but I'm a wannabe farmer. I'm a gardener, but I think that three things kind of rise to the top as far as things that farmers are worried about. These are the three that come to mind for me: are weeds, pests and diseases, and then the question of fertility. Is my soil fertile enough? Which is deeply related to yield. What's my yield going to be like? If I don't have fertile soil, I won't have a very good yield, right? So those three things, I think, are weighing on farmers' minds all the time. And the chemical model has a chemical solution to those questions, but and I can get into that when you want me to. But do you want me to get into that now?
Yeah, maybe. So that's a good entry into the conversation about chemical versus biological approaches to farming. And if I'm understanding correctly, it was right after World War II that chemical farming really took over.
It really, kind of took off then. Synthetic nitrogen had been invented well before that, decades before that. But I think it was really after World War II that it became like common usage for farmers to use synthetic nitrogen and use pesticides. And it's just kind of grown since then. And I think a lot of the reason it has grown is that we weren't really paying attention to these natural systems in the soil, the biological systems, which actually do all the things that farmers would want, the things that I mentioned before. They all can be solved with biology, but we had these tools that seemed kind of whiz bang. And of course, they're also very profitable for the companies that make these synthetic inputs, the fertilizer and the pesticide. So it was kind of like a snowball rolling downhill. It took on a momentum of its own. And I kind of say, like, right now I'm looking at it as it's kind of 5 against 1 for the farmers who want to switch out of this chemical style of agriculture, because there's all these entities in society that are telling them that, oh no, that's a bad idea. The way to do it is with chemicals. It's the only way. And that's like the researchers, like land grant researchers are in that. The government agencies that they interact with, the banks aren't going to give you a loan if you don't do it this way.
Okay.
That's 3.
That's 3. Okay.
There's also the community itself, like the community you live in. They can be brutal as far as like, oh, you can't do that. That's, and I think it's sort of a threat maybe to people who are doing it the chemical way. They see somebody doing it a different way. I mean, I'm not going to try to plumb the depths of the human psyche and why do people resist that.
Right. But we've been doing it that way for 70 years.
For a long time, and people are used to doing it. It's like, what do you mean you don't do it that way anymore? It's kind of like they come up against a lot of resistance from their own communities.
Right.
So,
and when you say do it that way, we're talking about using fertilizers that are based on fossil fuels, right?
They're used fossil fuels to make the fertilizer. It's a very creating synthetic nitrogen fertilizers is a very energy intensive process. Yeah. So,
and then pesticides and herbicides.
Yes.
Okay.
And herbicides are a type of pesticide. I think of pesticide as kind of like the umbrella term.
Okay.
And then under that is pesticides, insecticides, fungicides. So, but anytime you see that side at the end, CID at the end of a word, something's getting killed, right?
Right.
So, and that's one of the things I hear from farmers is the ones who've converted from conventional to regenerative and don't use those chemicals anymore. They say, it's really nice to wake up in the morning and instead of thinking, what am I going to kill on my farm today? What am I actually going to try to nurture? What's the life on my farm I'm going to try to nurture? That's like a revelation to these farmers who do transition despite all the things arrayed against them.
Right. And I know we're supposed to be talking about solutions and all the like wonderful things that happen when we do regenerative, but can you tell us really briefly, when you use all these things that kill things, when you use the synthetic inputs, what are just some of the worst consequences of that?
Well, I mean, one thing about them is that they're not smart bombs. You put something out there to kill a target pest, but it doesn't just kill the target pest. It kills lots of other things, including beneficial microbes that are actually help guard the plant against diseases and pests. And so you're kind of like undermining the natural system that already exists. And of course, I kind of like to engage common sense once in a while. I think it was Mark Twain who said that common sense is not so common anymore, but I'll try to engage some here where it's like, well, before we had all those chemicals to use in farming, what were the plants doing? Like, were they just waiting around for those to be invented? I mean, they were still growing and they were thriving. And especially you see it in natural systems, like the prairie was doing just fine without any synthetic nitrogen or any pesticides. So how were they protecting themselves, those plants protecting themselves from disease? They obviously had ways to do that. And the answer is those biological systems and that symbiosis between the microbes and the plants.
Right. Yeah. We've had corn for 10, 12,000 years.
Exactly.
Okay. So that's chemical farming. So in contrast, we have biological farming, and that is, why don't you just tell us?
Yeah, so, some people call it biological agriculture. There's lots of terms out there. I don't want to confuse people too much, but regenerative is an attractive name to me because, we have this term sustainable agriculture, which is fine, But one farmer said to me, well, why do we want to sustain a degraded resource?
Right.
We want to improve it, right? And so, yes, you don't want more soil to erode off your land because of your practices, but you also would like to build new soil. And how does that happen? That happens because of that symbiosis between the plants and the microbes in the soil. Because, I mean, what do plants do all day long? They take carbon out of the atmosphere and they put it in, some of it they put into the soil. I mean, some of it they use to make their own structures and everything. You know, they have their own agenda there to use it for themselves, but they also put a good deal of their of the carbohydrates and sugars they manufacture from photosynthesis. They put a lot of that into the ground to feed microbes. Now, why do they do that? Because the microbes then do something for them. I like to think of it in terms of superpowers, like the plant superpowers that it can do photosynthesis, and the animal life can't do that for the most part.
Right. And that's a pretty amazing superpower to take sunlight and create stuff out of it.
It's incredible. I mean, when you think about it, it makes all life on Earth possible. Without photosynthesis, we wouldn't be sitting here right now. All that solar energy would not be captured in some way.
Right.
So, I mean, so think about it as plants do that all day long, and they share it with some of it with the microbes, and the microbes then do something for them. And the superpower for the microbes is the enzymes they have. And when I say microbes, I'm talking mostly about bacteria and fungi. They have enzymes that will actually break down, the sand and silt and clay that are kind of the physical properties of the soil. They break those down, and even like pebbles and rocks and even boulders. I mean, sometimes you'll be walking in the forest and you'll see a tree. You've probably had this happen. You'll see a tree that has its roots wrapped around a big rock, and it's not in soil at all.
Right.
And yet, how is it surviving? It's because some of these things, like fungi in particular, have especially powerful enzymes. They can break down elements of that rock. And why do they do that? It's so they can extract minerals from the rock. And then they share those. They use some of those minerals for themselves, but they also share some of that with the plants. So it's a beautiful symbiosis. And a lot of what we do in chemical agriculture just kind of short circuits these systems. There's even like one example is like glyphosate, that is the most popular herbicide.
That's Roundup.
Roundup, exactly. Yeah. That I've been reading that interrupts chemical signaling between the microbes and the plant. And it's interesting because the microbes will kind of tell the plant to kind of gird itself, be ready for this infestation of some pathogen, because they can sense the pathogens, right? So, but the plant doesn't engage its immune defenses right away, because that would be a waste of energy. But at least it's now alerted to the possibility that there's something that's going to threaten it, a pathogen. So it's just kind of interesting. So that apparently, like glyphosate, messes with that system, that chemical signaling system. And that's just one of the things it does that's like disruptive in the soil.
All right. So let me just back up a little bit again. You're talking about building new soil. Like, why would we want to sustain? We want to actually build new soil. And that's because we're kind of in a soil crisis right now. Yes,
we are losing soil. Yeah. But, it's amazing, these regenerative farmers, like there was a gentleman named Gabe Brown that we interviewed in North Dakota for a recent film we did called Growing Solutions. And this is my plug for that documentary film.
Well done.
You can find it on YouTube. It's called Growing Solutions. End of pitch. But
be sure to like it.
Yeah, exactly. There you go. And Gabe Brown told us how he had some of his fields. When he started doing the regenerative model, he was a conventional farmer, very conventional. He shifted to regenerative practices, and he had farm fields that went from 6 inches of topsoil to 29 inches of topsoil. Now that's an astounding, and that was within 10 years, I believe.
Right.
So that's an astounding number to contemplate, because most people are in the ag world, most people are talking about, well, how do we slow down the rate of topsoil loss?
Right.
Not even
and it really
soil.
Is, we're losing it at a rapid rate.
Yeah,
it's scary.
Yes, there's a lot of it being lost. But if you're looking for any thread of hope, it's that you can actually not just arrest that development, but you can grow new soil. And where does new soil come from? I used to think it only came from when leaves fall on the ground. And there is some of that, and there's the weathering of rock and all that. But I think the main thing that creates new soil is this whole relationship between the plants and the microbes, because they're just creating tremendous amounts of soil organic matter. When things are happening the way they're supposed to, when there's a healthy soil, the cycling of nutrients between plants and microbes just goes at an incredible rate.
Yeah.
It's a very dynamic system if it's left undisturbed, right? And so that's the key right now, is to leave it undisturbed. So when we do that, we actually grow soil because, and it's kind of interesting because a lot of times the microbes don't get credit. I hear things said that are like, oh, well, that's about microbes, but they don't mention microbes. Like, for instance, farmers, even conventional farmers, are very interested in the amount of organic matter that is in their soil.
Right.
But they don't necessarily mention that, well, that's the microbes that, that organic matter is kind of
coming from the microbes.
It's coming from the microbes. It's kind of the sum total of all the living and dead things in the soil.
So are the microbes creating organic matter? Is it their waste products?
Well, I think my understanding of organic matters now is that it's all those things that dead plants, like the residue from plants. It's also like dead microbes. It's it's all those things and living. I guess I don't know if the living microbes are considered part of it, but certainly it's all that mass of things that are breaking down slowly in the soil, right? Yeah. And ideally, it breaks down kind of slowly. One thing, if we're going to talk about tillage, one of the things I would say is that kind of messes with that because it breaks up the organic matter. And so any farmer who really wants to improve their organic matter, they should minimize or eliminate tillage.
Right. Well, let's talk about tillage in a minute, but do you think we can talk about nutrients, the relationship? Since we're talking about microbes, they seem kind of like superstars. What do they do vis-a-vis nutrients?
Yes. So, well, it's interesting. The plant needs all these. I mentioned it does photosynthesis, but in order to do photosynthesis, it needs certain minerals. Like, for instance, manganese, as one example, is one of the things it needs. I believe it uses manganese to split the water molecule when it does photosynthesis. So it's a key element. Even though it only needs it in trace amounts, it needs it, essentially. It's an essential nutrient for the plant. Now, it can't get manganese from the air or anything. It doesn't have a way to directly get manganese. It gets it from the microbes. Okay. And what's interesting, depending on the plants, some of them associate with bacteria and some associate more with fungi. But I've also been reading that. So we've been told that legumes fix nitrogen, right? Right. And so, but it's not really the legume that's fixing the nitrogen. It's the bacteria that associate with them. Right. So again, it's a case where the microbe doesn't really get the credit, right? It's like, it's the bacteria that did it. It's not the legume itself, right?
Yeah. The microbes are doing all the work.
They're doing the work, right? And they're not really getting credited. So anyway, I'm here to give credit to the microbes today. So they do that, but there's also, it's not just legumes apparently that fix nitrogen or have this association. There's also some free-living bacteria in the soil, ones that do not get onto the root system. Okay. But they're out there in the soil and they are fixing nitrogen also. Then how does that nitrogen get to the plant root? Well, the fungi actually associate with the bacteria. They have some of these bacteria, nitrogen-fixing bacteria, in their bodies, in the fungal body, and then they share some of that with the plant. It's almost like the fungi seem to be sometimes, certain fungi are like an extension of the root system of the plant. Okay. They actually, you can see microscope pictures where it's like there's the fungi right inside the root itself. Like not just even on the outside of the root, but they actually set up shop inside the root. And there's a very long name. They're called arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi. That won't be on the test, but they called that because what they do inside the root is they set up a thing called an arbuscule, and that is just like it's a fancy name for like a transfer site for nutrients. So there's the fungi giving nutrients to the plant, and the plant is giving things back to the fungi. It's it's like I'll scratch your back kind of thing. Right. So that's kind of amazing in itself, is that they're inside the plant, right? That's one piece of it. But the other thing about nutrients, I've recently discovered there's a thing called the rhizophagy cycle. We don't need to be afraid of the word rhizophagy. All it means is root feeding. It's not. Scientists always have fancy ways of saying things that we can say in simpler ways. But root feeding cycle, right? The rhizophagy cycle is a cycle by which plants actually take microbes into their bodies. They suck them up through their root hairs, right? And then they extract nutrients from mostly bacteria. And then when they're done extracting those nutrients, they put the bacteria back into the soil. Some of the bacteria don't survive, but the ones that do, they put them back into the soil so they can get more nutrients. So it's almost like the plant is like farming the microbes. They're just like doing this
It's
cycle.
like
And
welcome to the matrix.
Exactly.
In the soil.
You get me some nutrients and
I'll suck it right out of you.
Yeah, exactly. But then they also give things to the bacteria because the bacteria are all hanging around the root system waiting for sugars to come out because that's part of their food supply. So it's really very collaborative.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a really complex and beautiful system. What are the services? I mean, everybody talks about the services that happen in regenerative agriculture.
Okay.
What can it do for us?
So we already talked about the nutrients. That's a great thing. I think the place to start is the soil structure, right?
Yeah.
Because if you didn't have biology in the soil, you would just have this thing, like we've all seen like a construction site where everything's been upended. Yeah. It's like, now it never looks like something you could grow anything in, right? Because for one thing, it's all compacted, right? And it doesn't look like that nice, rich brown soil that you see in the forest or on a farm that's regenerative, maybe.
Like, hard pan?
It's hard pan is a good way to put it. Yeah, it's very compacted, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the microbes that create that structure in the soil. What happens is, and I'll try not to nerd out too much, but the bacteria.
I think this is the place to nerd out.
Okay, good. All right, I have permission. The bacteria make these glues. They actually exude glues on their body, and that's kind of part of their survival strategy because they attach themselves. I mean, bacteria are really teeny, like a millionth of a meter wide, right? Mm-hmm. And they attach themselves to these pieces of organic matter in the soil, and that's a way that they ensure that they won't be washed away in the next, rainstorm or irrigation event or whatever it is. And so they also kind of like pull these pieces of organic matter together and make these what are called microaggregates. It's kind of like little balls of soil kind of. Then the fungi, if you have fungi in your soil, they will take these microaggregates and they kind of like corral them. Because the fungi has like these long strands. That's what, if you see them under the microscope, right? The fungi have these long strands called hyphae, right?
Right.
But those strands can be used like to kind of lasso these microaggregates together to make macro aggregates, bigger aggregates, right? Mm-hmm. And the macro aggregates are actually big enough we can see them. Mm-hmm. A regenerative farmer might take a shovel full of soil and show you like, oh, look how good the aggregation is in here, right? And that's one of the things. Again, it's a thing that gets measured now a lot, like soil aggregation, but they don't always mention that as the microbes. Again, I'm the spokesperson for the microbes.
Somebody needs a better agent.
Exactly, yeah. I'm the voice for the voiceless here. They are the ones who create those aggregates. It's if you don't have the bacteria and fungi in the soil, you don't have that nice aggregation, right? Mm. So why would you want to destroy those, elements of the soil with, whatever, all those sides we mentioned before, the pesticides, right? So when they do that, though, when they make these little aggregates, as you can imagine, it means that there's all this space in between.
Right.
When you have bigger pieces, of course, right?
Right. It's
sort of the difference between having like a pile of flour. Everything's got to be, it's these little teeny things that like scrunch together, right?
Right.
Versus having like a bowl of cereal or something. It's like there's all these spaces in between because the pieces are bigger, right?
Right.
So they make those pore spaces, which are very important. When I say pore, P-O-R-E, right? Mm-hmm. Those pore spaces allow a lot of things to get through. Water, for one thing, good water infiltration. Mm-hmm. And water is something that obviously is important to farmers. Yeah. You want to hold on to it. You want to keep it on your land. And you don't want it to be running off, right? So they allow water to come through. They allow air to come through because the microbes, the microbes we like are oxygen loving. They're aerobic.
Okay.
And so you want oxygen to be able to penetrate. We don't usually think of there being air in the soil, but in a healthy soil, there's enough air that all these things can survive. Okay. And then the other thing is plant roots. Mm-hmm. Plant roots can go deeper if you have this nice structure of soil, and you won't have that without biology.
Right.
And when you take away the biology, you take away that nice structure, basically.
Okay.
So that's one piece. That's only one.
That's one.
Check that off.
Okay.
But we did talk about nutrients already.
Yeah,
also.
we talked about nutrients.
And actually, we did mention the pests and diseases because they do also play the role in that. And actually, the amazing thing is I've seen under a microscope that if you take a leaf from a plant, a healthy plant, you will see there's like a matrix of bacteria and fungi. The bacteria will put down those glues I talked about on the leaf surface rather, and the fungi will kind of like have a network, a web around that because they'll kind of attach themselves to And fungi also make glues, but in this case, I think it's more the bacteria. They're creating this network, a web that actually protects the leaf from any kind of insect predator or any kind of pathogen that might come along. There's no entry point, because a healthy leaf will be covered with microbes.
So it's a natural pest repellent.
It's totally that. Yeah. And the pests will just have nowhere to go. I kind of think about this too, like when you see a leaf that has brown spots on it, well, that means that it didn't have that protection, right? And it kind of makes sense. Like maybe humans over time realize that, those brown leaves don't taste good, because they'll have some kind of pathogen on. They don't have the usual elements that you look for. So anyway, that explains kind of an aversion to something that is brown instead of that nice green color.
Okay, so and what about weed suppression?
So the strange thing about, I meant to mention that, like when we use fertilizer and we use pesticides, we basically create the need for more of those. The same is true with what a lot of the weed problem is dealt with tillage.
Right.
Not always. There's also herbicides that are used, but when you till, you actually create a situation where weeds are very happy. Because what are weeds really? I mean, weed is kind of a murky term, but I think in the soil food web school, I learned that a good way to define a weed is that it's the first plant that comes into a situation where there's bare soil, let's say. So something has to colonize that initially, right? And there's not much. If you've disturbed a piece of land, then it's most things won't grow there very well. But weeds tolerate poor soil. So the strange thing is, like, we hate weeds and we complain about them, but actually they do serve a very important purpose. Because in the grand scheme of things, you would rather have weeds on your soil than have bare soil. Bare soil is much worse. Right. So also the weeds are starting the process of what's called ecological succession. You're going to have weeds first, and then you're going to have grasses that come in. Early succession, mid and late succession grasses, and then you get into things like vines and bushes and things like that, the first woody things, and then you get to forest, and eventually you go all the way up to a mature forest. But all that happens, like, nature does that without any intervention from us, although we can help that along. We can actually help along that process and speed it up quite a lot. And the way we do that is with biological amendments, because that isn't going to happen, that succession, without, again, it's microbes who are helping drive that succession. And the other thing we find is when you go from the bare ground all the way up to mature forest, the ratio of fungi to bacteria keeps going up and up. In a mature forest, you can have like 1,000 to 1 fungi to bacteria, something like that. You'll find a lot less bacteria in that soil that's been disturbed and is bare ground. It's a bacterial dominated soil. That's who comes in first, as far as the biology, right? And that's a bad thing in some ways, because bacteria, they have a lot of carbon in their, they actually have a lot of nitrogen in their bodies. They don't want as much carbon as other organisms, right? The ones that eat them. So when left to their own devices, they're going to treat carbon as a waste product. So if you have a bacterial dominated soil, they're going to be giving off lots and lots of carbon. And where's that carbon going to go? But up into the atmosphere, which is what we don't want, right? Which is a good reason to not till, for instance, because what happens when we till? We create a bacterial dominated soil, which is hospitable to weeds. Just bringing it back around to your question from 12 minutes ago.
All right. So this is a good segue into carbon sequestration and how the soil can help with that.
Yes, and it certainly can. Well, because I remember when I interviewed this woman, Elaine Ingham, who's a soil ecologist, one of her quotes was, if you want to sequester carbon, grow more fungi, right? And I was intrigued by that. And, as it turns out, fungi, as I mentioned, are very carbon specific. They have a very high carbon to nitrogen ratio, right? So if you make the soil hospitable to them, then you will sequester more carbon. And you can do that. You can amend your soil with, say, compost. The main thing would be compost. And when you make compost, you can design your inputs such that you can favor fungi more.
Okay, wait. So, but just to totally clarify, when we talk about sequestering carbon, we're talking about having the fungi, either one, store the carbon in their bodies.
Yes.
So that it's not going out into the atmosphere.
Exactly.
And that's what we mean by sequestering.
Well, that is one way, certainly, that carbon is sequestered. Yeah, is in the bodies of these creatures because they are very carbonaceous, if you will. They're,
right.
So, yeah.
So the carbon is being stored under the soil instead of warming the planet by being in the atmosphere.
Exactly. And actually, when you look at a forest, a mature forest, I think it's about half of the carbon. We think of the carbon as being in the trees. That's how I always thought of it.
Right.
But half of the carbon is in the soil, in the fungi.
Okay.
And the fungi create those hyphae, those strands, right? And a lot of that is just very complex carbon molecules that are very stable because they're complex, they're stable. So fungi, I mentioned before, they have very strong enzymes. And so they can break down complex things. In fact, they're used, if you want to talk about services and other services, that they break down toxins. Yeah. Or they make the toxins, they put them in a form that's not going to affect us, right? So as they build those strands, the older the hyphae, the more carbon it tends to have in it. Okay. The only part of the strand that has like a decent amount of nitrogen is the part that's at the tip that's still growing, right? Okay. And sometimes things do prey on fungi, but they tend to only prey on that little tip at the end, and they leave the rest intact because it's too complex. They can't break it down. So it's kind of interesting that fungi are a little protected in that way, and maybe you know this, but the largest organism that's been discovered on the planet is a fungus. Oh, wow. In the Pacific Northwest, and it's like 20 miles wide, and
right. And this is where we have trees talking to each other through the hyphae.
Absolutely, yeah. And they're a network. They are a network of nutrients and messaging. Really, sometimes they even carry water to plants or trees. So, So it's an amazing symbiosis. And so, the last thing we want to do is like disrupt that symbiosis because it does all these good things for us. Right. And I think people are more and more recognizing that, and that's going to be what tips things over. I mean, this is all very like incipient right now. It's just beginning to be, the way people look at farming now. And it's these folks who are doing the regenerative. I don't know exactly what percentage of farmers there, but they're a small percentage, right? But you got to start somewhere. You have to have those early adopters, those pioneers, right? And they're out there. Right.
So they're the ones out there saying, look, these organisms will do the work for us if we let them.
Exactly. Yeah. And also another message that resonates, of course, is you're going to save a whole lot of money on inputs if you let nature do its work. Right. And you also do things that help.
Right. Because how can you improve on a system that just takes sunlight and turns it into stuff that you need?
I mean, I'm not a betting person, but if you said to me, Leo, which would you bet on this system that's been around for millions of years? The symbiosis between microbes and plants has been around for millions, in fact, billions in the case of bacteria and plants. So it's been around that long, and we've only had this chemical way of doing things for less than a century. Yeah. I mean, it's an easy call, right? Which one am I going to bet on,
Right. So are there more benefits that we haven't talked about? We've talked about carbon, we've talked about nutrients, fertility, pests, weeds. Yeah. Why don't you tell us what are the principles? Like what happened? Oh, sure. How do people do this?
Sure. And I might need to refer to my notes here. There are 5 principles I keep saying in regenerative agriculture, and 2 of them seem related to each other. But one of them is minimize soil disturbance. Kind of like we've been saying, why would you disturb these? There's a whole ecology below the surface. Right. Why would you want to basically create a disaster? It's like a unnatural disaster area that you're creating when you till. So you minimize tillage or eliminate it entirely. The other one is they say put armor on the soil always have some kind of, never have bare soil basically, right? Which kind of relates to the idea of don't till, but so don't have bare soil because all kinds of bad things happen because you have bare soil. And one of the things is, well, how are those microbes going to eat? If there's no plant life to feed them, then they're going to either die or go dormant and wait for a better situation to develop. So that's the second one. Diversity is a big one. You want to have more diverse, say crops, like crop rotations and cover crops. You can have mixes of cover crops because the more diversity you have above ground, that drives diversity below ground. You can attract different kinds of microbes with different types of plants. And that's helpful. Diversity makes the whole system work better.
So when we talk about cover crops, we're talking about like alfalfa and radishes. What
it could be a lot of
things we
things.
plant so in the winter we have
Yes.
things growing in the ground in the winter.
Yes, sometimes it's winter, sometimes it's planted other times of the year. It
Mhm.
depends on, the climate where the farmer is and everything. But yes, it's those kind of things. And they'll put out, sometimes they refer to as cocktails, like a cover crop cocktail, which I think is funny.
So it's not crops that we're actually harvesting to eat.
They're not,
Right.
They don't tend to be. Some of them may cross over, but also some of them may be things that you can harvest and sell to your neighbor who has animals.
Right.
Some of it is forage.
Okay.
Or they might even turn loose animals sometimes they turn their own animals or somebody else's animals loose in the field. So they do have a use. And, people might think, oh, you're wasting that. I'm not growing a cash crop, so this is a waste, but it doesn't really work that way. Like when you look at the, on balance, you're doing much better because you're going to have a better yield from your cash crop. And you do have some ways to make some money from the cover crops as well. So, and a lot of the people that might be saying that they might be leaving that ground bare all winter. Right. I mean, I kind of cringe now when I drive around and I see all the bare soil in places. I'm like, I think of it as a missed opportunity when you have bare soil. It's almost like you're saying, the photosynthesis that happens, it's like a factory, really. Like it's like a carbon factory, and when you have bare soil, it's like you're saying, oh, we decided to shut down the factory for 3 months or 6 months. It's like, why? Because anything growing there would be better than bare soil.
Right. The factory's working for free. It's not charging you anything.
Right, exactly. And only bad things are happening while that soil is bare. Heat is rising from it. It's, the microbes are dying because they're exposed to. So, it's just a lot of bad things. So it just makes perfect sense to always have it covered. So that's the armor on the soil. We talked about diversity. Yeah. There's also, they say a living root in the soil at all times, like something that's living, which it goes to the question of who's feeding the microbes. It has to be a living root, right? If it's dead, it's no longer putting out exudates, which is what the name they use for when the carbohydrates and sugars and other things are put out into the soil by the plant. They call them exudates. Right. So we have to have a fancy word for everything. And then the other one is to integrate animals into the operation, because animals provide something, they're kind of like compost machines that when they're walking around your field, they have all these microbes in their systems, and they help inoculate the soil with microbial, with microbial life as well.
Right. So which increases the diversity.
Increases diversity. It also, attracts things like dung beetles that are important. Yeah. So there's all these benefits from animals being involved, and we kind of have separated those things out. We Right. As you mentioned, like we have factory farms that are specializing in only animals, and they have other people who are growing just corn and soy, and they don't have any animals. Right. It's kind of interesting to me because I always think about the fact that if you go to a financial planner, what's the thing they say to you? Their mantra is diversify your portfolio, right? Right. Like that way you spread out your risk, right? Right. But yet we have people telling farmers to just grow corn and soy, just specialize. Yeah. And that the regenerative farmers, they're diversifying their portfolio. They're not dependent on one crop to be successful, and like, oh, the price of corn went down, so I'm kind of like in a pickle this year because, they have lots of other crops too. Right. And so they're not like dependent on one thing.
Right. Can you do regenerative without animals, or do you really?
Oh, you can. You can. And also it's funny because sometimes people talk about external inputs, and they're talking about, getting the synthetic nitrogen and things like that. But I don't really consider that external input. If you have a neighbor down the street who has excess manure, and they say, hey, I'll give you my chicken manure, my cow manure, and maybe there's something else in the trade, but there's nothing wrong with that. It's one landscape. So it's like, so if a neighbor can provide you with that, you don't turn your nose up at it. It's fertility, but you can also create a lot of fertility without the animal. I mentioned the manure is valuable, but I think there's some farmers don't necessarily use animals in their operation because there's a lot of crops you can grow that do put, they even refer to them as green manures. Oh yeah. You grow it and then you till it some people till it into the ground.
And the tilling doesn't create a problem?
Well, I say tilling, like that's how some people are doing it. Right. There's also people who do this thing. Now, I've just learned about this recently, but it's called planting green. And it means that you're not tilling the soil when you convert from your cover crop, say, to your cash crop. So you want to put in a cash crop, and you've had this cover crop growing all winter, let's say, and you want to terminate the cover crop, is the term they use. And So you have something called a roller crimper.
Oh yeah, I've
right?
seen those.
Yeah, it's
yeah.
kinda
And they
neat.
just sort of like tuck it under the soil,
Yeah,
right?
it exactly. And it looks
Yeah.
very too simple almost. It's like, wow, that really does the job. But
Yeah.
as they're doing that though, they also plant the cash crop.
Yeah.
So they're saving themselves some diesel fuel because
Right.
they're not going over the land twice, right?
Right.
And they're also putting all that stubble from the cover crop. They're
Right.
keeping it on site.
And it can just decompose in the soil. Yeah.
and feed you know who. So
Mhm.
so there's lots going on that's beneficial there, and you haven't disturbed the soil.
Right.
If you do it, if you plant, you're doing planting green.
Right.
So
The roller crimper is a very
it
cool looking tool.
it seems like it might be
Yeah.
like kind of one of the future things that every farmer will have in the future. I don't know.
Yeah. So, one of the things that farmers seem to be dealing with a lot lately is extreme weather, which we know is from climate change. Extreme weather being things like drought, and then on the other side, extreme, very heavy rains.
Yes.
And how does a farmer doing regenerative agriculture weather the weather compared to conventional?
Well, much better. Well, I'll tell a story from Gabe Brown again. Like he was smart enough to have people from the Natural Resources Conservation Service come out to his farm and measure his infiltration rate into his soil. How fast does water infiltrate into his soil, right?
And the faster, the better.
The faster, the better.
Right.
Yeah. If you have like now he's in a place that's actually very arid. I didn't realize that North Dakota is a very dry state, right? And so, but they do get torrential rains occasionally. And so when he said that,
and you want the soil to absorb the rain.
Yes.
That is a healthy system.
Yes.
Yeah.
The strange thing about it is like the pore spaces that I mentioned before, they're helpful to let the water infiltrate quickly, but then the soil organic matter that you want to have a lot of, that acts like a sponge and takes up the water. Okay. So what it does really act like a sponge. When you think about you pour water onto a sponge, it takes up all the water until it can't anymore, and then the rest drains out, but drains out slowly. It doesn't. You're not washing it off the top of the surface of the soil, which of course is how a lot of soil gets lost, right? And that also happens because tillage will create this hard pan layer that no water can penetrate, right?
Right.
But if you're keeping cover on the soil all the time, then you're not going to have that hard pan layer. You're going to have good structure in the soil that allows water to infiltrate. Now, when the NRCS came out to Gabe Brown's farm in North Dakota, they measured his water infiltration rate as an inch of rain every 9 seconds.
Wow.
Yeah, and 2 inches every 25 seconds. So, and he said that's a bigger than any rainstorm we ever have here in that short amount of times, right? So, and the thing about it is, even if there's more water than the sponge can hold, as long as it has a way to get through, it's going to end up in like springs, and it's going to be, in groundwater and springs. It's not going to be washing in a torrent across the land. It's going to be this gradual thing where the water, slowly filters through, right? So, so yeah, they're very well fixed for an extreme weather event like that. And this also speaks to the question of drought, because you mentioned drought, right? And if you have that sponge, well, there's going to be a lot more water available for a lot longer time, because it has if you have high organic matter content, then you're going to have a lot of water.
So the soil is staying moister than it would otherwise.
It's amazing how long the water will stay there, actually. And if you have the fungi, they actually sometimes transport water to the plant even. So yeah, and of course everything in the soil needs water too, but yeah, it will. And again, it's also like the cover. When you have that green cover on the soil, it doesn't get as hot. It's not like evaporating all the time. Like when you have bare soil, that's one of the things that's going to happen is you have all this water vapor going up into the atmosphere. Okay. And actually that, I want to say that relates to climate change also, because there are a lot of scientists now looking at water vapor as one of the key greenhouse gases.
Yeah.
Now it's sort of a lot like carbon, because carbon, we don't want to get rid of carbon. It's not a pollutant. Right. The problem with
we need it in the right place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We need to take some of it out of the atmosphere and put it into the ground, right? Yeah. And the same is true of water vapor. You could say the same. It's the same kind of situation because there's so much water vapor in the air. That's why you have these bigger hurricanes that are that have more water associated with them because there's just more water up there in the atmosphere that used to be in the ground.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So you're creating this, you're creating this system. The other thing I've been reading about lately is, so when you have a lot of heat, so when there's tillage happening in the spring, right, all over the Midwest and other parts of the U.S., but especially the Midwest, you have all this tillage. They can show you a satellite image of a carbon cloud that forms over the northern hemisphere, because when you till, you're cutting up that organic matter, right? And when that happens, there's kind of like a feeding frenzy. Like there's a certain species of bacteria even that like they'll go crazy on all this surface area. Like when you cut something up into small pieces, now there's more surface area for those bacteria to act upon.
Right.
So they just chew it up really fast. But what do they do? As we mentioned earlier, bacteria blow off carbon.
Right.
They don't want a lot of carbon in their bodies. They have more nitrogenous. They have more nitrogen. So they blow off carbon. And where's that going? It's going up into the atmosphere, right?
Right.
And so for all kinds of reasons, the tillage is contributing to this climate effect. And also when you have all this heat, now you create sort of a heat dome, right, over this farmland, right? And then when normally there's going to be these cooler air masses that come in from the ocean, right? But a big high pressure hot heat dome will block them, right? It will block them from coming in. So that's why you're not getting as much water from the ocean as you used to get. Like used to be, you'd get more storms coming over from the ocean, and also things would be the precipitation would be more spread out.
Right.
Now it's like kind of feast or famine. Like you have these droughts because of this heat dome. And then you have, maybe later you have when the heat dome goes away, then you have like a huge rain event.
Torrential, yeah.
I don't pretend to understand all the meteorology of it, but it's very interesting. That heat dome effect is very fascinating, actually.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Yeah. So you mentioned that there's a very small percentage of farmers using these practices now.
Right.
And ideally, what would be great is to see people transition from conventional to regenerative. But what is keeping that from happening?
Well, I often boil things down to a propaganda war, honestly.
Yeah.
Well, because there's a lot of money in those inputs, in those input industries, right? And, it's hard to come up against that, because who has deep pockets and not only can advertise about how great these things are to farmers, but also poo-poo research that says that, we don't really need them. And also fund their own research that says, just kind of muddies the waters and says, oh, no, it's not really like that. Or things are still unclear. It's like, somebody wrote a book, I think, called Merchants of Doubt, talking about the chemical companies. And I think that's what the whole strategy is, like, create doubt in people's minds, like make them feel confused about, I don't know what the right way is to farm. You know what I mean? And so,
Right. So this has been working for 70 years. Why don't I just stick with the thing that's been working?
Maybe we just need to tweak it. But yeah. And they're trying to solve problems within this kind of internal logic of, this chemical didn't work. Let's try, here's a better chemical.
Right. Right.
It's things like
that. Or
that.
like, my weeds have grown resistant to this herbicide. Let me try a different herbicide.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And that's all comes to the point of mindset. Like that brings up the question of mindset, which I think is so important. And it's like, if we have the mindset that we can, outsmart nature, that we can just have this one, silver bullet solution, like, here's a pest, here's a chemical that kills it, end of story, I mean, that's a very like reductionist way of looking at it, right? But if you change, there's a great quote from this rancher, actually. His name is Don Campbell, and he's from Saskatchewan. He said that if you want to make small changes, change the way you do things. But if you want to make major changes, change the way you see things. And I think that gets to that point of, what is your mindset? How do you see your farm? Is it just a war against pests? Or is it an ecosystem where I'm trying to get it in balance so that a pest species doesn't have its way?
Is it a battle, or is it a collaboration?
Exactly.
Ideally, your farmers collaborating with all these unpaid laborers who do all this work for you constantly.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. It's a tremendous amount of effort that goes in.
But so what could help farmers make this transition? Is it about monetary incentives? Is it cultural mindset?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more about the mindset, the cultural mindset. And the great thing about this is that no farmer who might be listening right now has to take my word for any of this,
Right.
because I'm not a farmer, but there are lots of farmers out there who are already doing it, and they're kind of like leading the way. Like I was just listening to a webinar by this guy, Jonathan Lundgren, who's an entomologist, and he studies regenerative versus conventional. Not many people are doing that kind of research, but he's doing that. And he was saying that the farmers are leading this revolution, or whatever you want to call it. They are the ones who are out front. And it's funny because they also, you don't think of farmers and like science, like being immersed in science, right? But, I read this magazine called Acres USA, and they call themselves the voice of eco-agriculture. Okay. But if you look at the articles in there, there's a whole lot of science in some of those articles. Yeah. These folks are really heavy into the science. Yeah. And, there's another farmer I can mention is this guy, Adam York. He's a farmer in Illinois who on the surface might seem like he was a very conventional farmer, and he still grows corn and soy, but he totally bought into the biological approach. And he now has a microscope of his own. He's like, I'm going to look at this stuff, Right. So he's on his microscope often, but he doesn't, it doesn't stop there. He also designs his own inputs, biological inputs now. So he will look at what's missing from my soil, and then he designs a, whatever it be, a compost tea, an extract, a foliar spray, whatever it might be to help his plants along, but he does not use the pesticides anymore. So, or for the most part, he's eliminated them. And these farmers will also talk about how much money they save. There's a guy in Indiana, Rick Clark, who says that by eliminating all these inputs, he saves $1.3 million a year, he estimated. And that was on 7,000 acres. He's saving $1.3 million. I mean, that's the kind of thing that will speak to a lot of farmers. I mean, there's the cultural piece, but if you start telling farmers they can save that much money, because I'm sure one of the main things that farmers complain about now is the cost of these inputs are going up at a ridiculous rate that outpaces inflation for whatever reason. It sounds like price gouging to me, but if you're outpacing inflation, then it sounds like you're gouging somebody. But at any rate,
but we're not economists. We're just theorizing.
Yeah, we're just theorizing here. Exactly. But at any rate, that is a big complaint of farmers. And it's like, how do you survive if the input costs keep going up, but the price you get for your corn or soy or whatever you're selling, that's not going up at the same rate, not even close, right? And sometimes it dips, so it just doesn't, the economics of it don't add up, basically.
Right. Yeah. So I wonder if there are policies that would incentivize, or if it just has to be like sort of a flip of a switch, like I'm going to take this big risk and try.
Sadly, exactly. Sadly, I think that policy is usually the last one through the door, unfortunately. Although I did see, I was looking at some numbers or a report about these kinds of legislation related to regen practices. And I was surprised to see like planting green was mentioned in one of those, in a law that was passed. It was at the county level, though, I believe. So, I mean, that's how it might start, at the county level. And it's also just that peer-to-peer, like farmers talk to other farmers. And the other thing that's nice about it is, if you're looking for any hopeful threads here, the farmers who are doing regenerative, they don't want to take this beautiful light and hide under a rock.
Right.
They want to tell whoever will listen.
They're not keeping it a secret.
No, they're not proprietary.
And they like having buddies to talk about this stuff. Well, I have this many species in my soil. How many do you have?
Absolutely. Yeah. What's your cover crop cocktail this year? Yeah, exactly.
Right.
No, I mean, it just makes sense, right? It's just human behavior, going back to that. But they are very forthcoming. If I'm a farmer who is doing conventional all along, and I'm suddenly curious about this, you can go on YouTube or other venues and
it does seem like a very collaborative, networking,
very collaborative, and there's lots you can learn, because not just the farmers, but also there's scientists who do lots of webinars and such, and explain this and try to explain it in a way that you and I can understand. So so that that's also another hopeful sign.
Well, so is there anything we haven't talked about that you feel like needs to be said? Any other great quotes, or you really brought it today with the quotes.
I do have one other quote, and this is from a guy named David Johnson, who is farms in this very dry climate in New Mexico, and he says that microbes are the backbone of every organism and ecosystem on this living planet. No organism can survive without its resident microbiome. No organism can survive without its resident microbiome. Now that's fascinating, and it goes to. I did think of something we didn't talk about, was the the minerals that the microbes in the soil get for the plant.
Yeah.
It's amazing. I've seen a chart where it says, here are all the nutrients that a plant needs, all the minerals, or whatever, for proper functioning, right?
Right.
They match up almost perfectly with what humans need.
Right. Because that's what we didn't talk about, was what we're eating and how that nutritional component changes.
Yes, it certainly does. Yeah. And that's the thing, is because we've emphasized things like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, we have all these fertilizers that emphasize that.
Right.
Well, we're leaving out all these micronutrients that you don't need a lot of. The plant doesn't need a lot of, but it needs it very critically, even though it doesn't need much, like the manganese I mentioned earlier. Right. The same in the human body, right? We have lots of micronutrients that we need very critically. Right. And if we don't get them, so basically, if the plant doesn't get those minerals, then how are we going to get them? Because that's how we, how we get our.
And there is perhaps some research showing that the nutritional quality has changed over time.
It has gone down. The level of minerals in each of these food sources has gone down.
Has gone down.
Yeah.
And there's hope that with regenerative practices, the nutrient composition will
go back up, because you'll be, re-energizing that relationship there.
Yeah.
And there's actually, I forget the name of it now, but there's a mechanism now you can use, a little machine that will test. If you're in the supermarket and there's carrots piled up, you can test how much mineral is in that. It's very interesting. I'm blanking on the name of it, but that's a way that we're going to be able to actually measure, this increase. But there was a huge study out of the UK that looked at what you're talking about, the decline in mineral content, and that's significant. I mean, we're eating. It may explain why we need more calories, because our bodies are going to keep asking for more
because they're not getting the nutrients.
Exactly, because it's not just about calories, of course.
Right.
And the body knows when it's not getting what it needs. So
right. Yeah. Just put anything in here. I'll extract whatever nutrients I can get from it. Yeah. Right,
exactly. And of course, in our guts, the microbes again are critical, right?
Yeah.
We can't live without them.
Right. The microbes are doing the work.
They're doing the work. I used to think they help us digest food, but I think that in some cases they digest the food, period. I believe that's what it seems like now.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Great. Well, this has been a really interesting conversation. Thank you very much. I think you nerded out. I think you did it.
Just the right amount, hopefully.
Just the right amount of nerding out.
There's a nerd of meat over there that told me when I was going too high.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. This has been really fun.
Okay.
This is an episode of Unconfined, a podcast of the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future in Baltimore, Maryland. You can find us online at clf.jhsph.edu.